Right now, you have a sense of who you are. A quiet, background feeling that there is a you, consistent, continuous, recognizable. You know your name. You know what you like and what you don't. You know how you tend to respond when things go wrong. You know the kind of person you are. Or at least, you believe you do. And that belief is so deep, so automatic, so woven into the fabric of everything you experience, that it has probably never occurred to you to seriously question it. But what if the person you think you are is not who you actually are? What if the self you carry around is mostly a story? And what if the story was never fully yours to begin with? This is not a trick question, and it is not philosophy designed to confuse. It is something that decades of psychology and neuroscience have quietly been pointing toward, that the stable, continuous self you experience is less like a solid object and more like a running narrative. A story your brain constructs, moment to moment, from fragments of memory, emotion, habit, and expectation. A story that feels completely real because you are always inside it. And a story that has been shaped, edited, and handed to you by forces you were never fully aware of. Think about how you would describe yourself to someone who had never met you. You'd reach for certain words, certain qualities, certain patterns you've noticed in yourself over time. And those descriptions would feel accurate. They would feel like facts rather than interpretations. But here is what is interesting. Almost everything in that description was formed before you were old enough to choose it, before you had the cognitive tools to evaluate it, before you had any real understanding of who else you could have been under different circumstances. The person you think you are is real. The experiences that shaped them happened. But the interpretation of those experiences, the meaning you drew from them, the identity you built around them, that was constructed, quietly, automatically, by a young mind, doing its best to make sense of a world it didn't yet understand. And that construction has been running ever since. Not as a choice, as a default. And tonight, it is worth asking, for the first time, or the 100th, whether the self you've been living as is the only self that was ever possible. Every person you have ever met was once a child who knew nothing. Not just facts, nothing about who they were. No personality, no preferences, no sense of being introverted or extroverted, confident or anxious, lovable or difficult. None of it. What existed was potential, vast, open, unwritten. And then the world began, very quietly, to write on it. You didn't choose your first beliefs about yourself. They were given to you by people who were, themselves, given theirs. The earliest experiences leave the deepest marks, not because they are the most significant, necessarily, but because they arrive before you have any framework to interpret them. A child who is consistently comforted learns that distress is temporary and that the world is a place that responds. A child who is ignored or inconsistently held learns something different, that need is dangerous, that closeness is uncertain, that it is safer to manage alone. These are not conscious conclusions. They are felt impressions, wired into the nervous system before language even exists to name them. By the time you reach school age, you already had a working model of yourself. A rough sketch of who you were, how safe the world was, whether people could be trusted, whether you were the kind of person good things happened to. You didn't write that sketch. It emerged from thousands of tiny interactions, a parent's tone of voice, a teacher's reaction, a moment of praise, a moment of shame. The sketch felt true because it was all you knew. And brains, especially young brains, do not hold their conclusions loosely. They build on them. You have been living inside a self-portrait that was painted before you could hold the brush. The painful part is not that this happened. It happens to everyone, without exception. The painful part is how completely invisible this process remains for most of a lifetime. People spend decades wondering why they keep responding a certain way, why a particular kind of situation always makes them shrink or rage or disappear, why success feels dangerous or closeness feels threatening or being alone feels like punishment. The answer is almost always the same. It was written early, in a language you didn't yet know you were learning. There is something you rely on, more than almost anything else, to know who you are. It is your memory of what happened to you, Your memory of how you responded. Your memory of the moments that mattered, the ones that hurt, the ones that made you who you are. Memory feels like the most reliable thing you have, like a record, an archive, a personal history that cannot be rewritten. And yet, it is the most unreliable narrator you will ever trust. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, your brain doesn't retrieve a fixed file. It rebuilds the experience from fragments, using your current emotional state, your current beliefs, and the story you are currently telling about yourself. This means that every time you access a memory, you are also, subtly, changing it. The memory you have today of something that happened 10 years ago is not the same memory you had 5 years ago. It has been updated, silently, to fit the version of yourself you have become since then. You are not remembering the past. You are remembering the last time you remembered it. And each time, it shifts, just slightly, in the direction of who you currently believe yourself to be. This matters enormously for identity, because so much of who you think you are rests on your memory of what happened to you. The story of your childhood, the story of your failures, the story of who hurt you, and how, and what it means. If memory is a reconstruction, then the self built on memory is also, at least partly, a reconstruction. Not a lie, not an invention, but a living interpretation, one that shifts as you shift, that bends to accommodate your current needs, that protects certain beliefs about yourself by quietly adjusting the evidence. Studies have shown that people can be given false memories, not through manipulation, but through the simple process of suggestion and the brain's drive to fill in gaps with plausible material. People have vividly remembered events that never happened, remembered feelings they never felt, remembered being a certain kind of person in situations that unfolded quite differently. None of this is conscious deception. It is the brain doing what it always does, building coherence, maintaining narrative, protecting the self-story from information that would make it collapse. At some point, someone told you who you were. Maybe it was a parent who said, "You are the sensitive one." Maybe it was a teacher who said, "You're not a math person." Maybe it was a sibling who called you the funny one, or the difficult one, or the responsible one. Maybe it was so subtle, it was never said out loud at all, just implied, in the roles that were assigned to you, the expectations that were held for you, the reactions you received when you stepped outside the version of yourself that the people around you had decided you were. These labels, these roles, these quiet, consistent messages about who you are, they don't just influence you. They become you. The brain, especially the young brain, is extraordinarily sensitive to social feedback. It uses the reactions of others as its primary data source for constructing a sense of self. This is not weakness. It is biology. Social belonging once determined survival, and social belonging requires fitting into a role. So the brain adapts. It shapes itself to match the version of you that the environment is reinforcing. And then it calls that shape identity. You didn't become who you are. You became who you were allowed to be. And then you forgot that those were two different things. The cruelest part of this process is how permanent it feels. People carry labels from childhood into adulthood, into old age, with absolute conviction that those labels describe something fixed and true about them. The child who was told they were not smart becomes the adult who doesn't apply for the job. The child who learned their emotional needs were too much becomes the adult who apologizes for wanting things. The child who was praised only for achievement becomes the adult who cannot rest without guilt. The label was placed, the identity was constructed around it, and the construction was sealed so early it was mistaken for nature. This is not about blame. The people who gave you these labels were themselves operating from labels they were given. The patterns move through generations, not because anyone intended harm, but because unexamined identities tend to reproduce themselves. A parent who was taught their feelings were inconvenient will often, without realizing it, teach their child the same thing. Not cruelly, automatically, because that is the only model of self they ever knew. And a model, never questioned, becomes a template, passed forward, without consent, without awareness, until someone, somewhere, stops long enough to ask, where did this actually come from? There is a version of you that exists at work, and a version that exists with your family. A version that shows up with close friends, and a different version that shows up with people you don't fully trust. A version in moments of confidence, and another in moments of fear. Most people are aware, on some level, that they adjust themselves depending on context. What most people are not aware of is how deep those adjustments go, and how often the adjusted version is the one they've mistaken for their real self. The mask worn long enough stops feeling like a mask. It starts feeling like a face. And by then, you've forgotten what was underneath. Psychologists call this the persona, the social face we construct to navigate the world's expectations. The persona is not a lie, exactly. It develops for real reasons, from real pressures. The child who learned that anger was unacceptable develops a persona of calm. The child who learned that vulnerability brought punishment develops a persona of self-sufficiency. The child who discovered that being entertaining kept the peace develops a persona of humor. These are genuine adaptations. They served a real purpose. The problem is not that they form. The problem is when they become permanent. When the mask becomes permanent, something strange happens. You begin to defend it, as though it were you. Someone challenges your self-sufficiency, and you feel genuinely threatened, not because the challenge is wrong, but because the self-sufficiency is the architecture your identity rests on. Someone sees through your humor to the sadness underneath, and something flinches, not because you are ashamed of the sadness, but because being seen, without the mask, feels dangerous in a way you cannot quite explain. The mask was built for protection, and the brain remembers that protection was necessary. What makes this particularly difficult to see is that the mask is rarely experienced as external. It is experienced as self. Your calm doesn't feel like suppressed anger. It feels like calm. Your self-sufficiency doesn't feel like a defense against vulnerability. It feels like strength. Your humor doesn't feel like a way of staying safe. It feels like personality. And because it feels like self, the idea that it might be something you are wearing rather than something you are, that idea feels not just wrong, but offensive. Like an accusation. Like being told the most real thing about you is not real at all. There is a particular feeling that arrives when someone challenges your identity. Not just your opinion, your identity. When someone implies that the way you see yourself is incomplete or inaccurate or built on something you haven't examined. The feeling is not intellectual discomfort. It is closer to physical threat. Something tightens, something rises, and the mind moves very quickly to push back, to find the reasons the challenge is wrong, the reasons the person making it is mistaken or malicious, the reasons that nothing about the self needs to be revised. Identity threat feels like physical danger, because to the brain, they are the same thing. This is not dramatic. It is neuroscience. The same neural systems that respond to threats in the physical environment also respond to threats to the self-concept. Social pain activates the same brain regions as physical pain. The prospect of losing your sense of who you are triggers the same alarm systems as the prospect of losing your physical safety. So when the self is challenged, the brain does not engage in open-minded reflection. It defends, it dismisses, it attacks, because the survival response does not wait for philosophical consideration. This is why it is so difficult to tell someone something true about themselves that they do not yet want to hear, and why it is equally difficult to hear it yourself. The truth that threatens the self-story will almost always feel, initially, like a lie. It will feel like an attack on something sacred, like someone trying to take away something that is yours. But what they are really pointing at is the gap between the self you have constructed and the self that might be possible if the construction were ever genuinely examined. The things you defend hardest about yourself are almost never the things that need the least examination. They are usually the things that need it most. The defense of identity is not a character flaw. It is a deeply human response to a deeply human need. We need to know who we are. We need continuity, coherence, a story that holds together. But there is a difference between a self that is stable because it is genuinely known and a self that is stable because it is never questioned. One is the stability of a tree with deep roots. The other is the stability of a wall that holds its shape. only because nothing has been allowed to push against it. And walls, unlike trees, do not grow. You have never seen yourself. Not really. You have seen photographs and reflections. You have heard recordings of your voice and watched yourself in videos. But you have never experienced yourself the way another person does. You do not know how you seem when you are not trying to seem like anything. You do not know the look on your face when you think no one is watching. You do not know the tone your voice takes in moments of stress or the way your energy changes when you enter a room. You only ever know yourself from the inside, and the inside view is deeply incomplete. Research suggests that others often perceive qualities in us that we genuinely cannot see in ourselves, not because they know us better, exactly, but because they have access to information we don't. They see the pattern across interactions. They see how we behave when we think the conversation is about something else. They see the contradiction between what we say we value and how we actually spend our time. They see the gap between the person we present and the person we reveal when we are tired or afraid or comfortable enough to stop performing. Other people are not seeing a distorted version of you. Sometimes they are seeing a clearer one. This is uncomfortable because we tend to assume that self-knowledge is the most direct and reliable knowledge available. I know myself better than anyone, the logic goes, because I have access to my own inner experience. And that is true, but inner experience is not the same as accurate self-perception. You have access to your thoughts and feelings, but you do not have reliable access to your blind spots, to the patterns you cannot see, precisely because you are inside them, to the ways your behavior contradicts your self-image in moments you are not consciously watching. The version of you that others see is not the truth, but it is a truth. It contains information that your internal view does not. The person who tells you, carefully, that you seem distant, even when you feel engaged, they are not wrong. The person who notices that you become defensive before there is anything to defend, they are not wrong. The person who sees your generosity when you see only your selfishness, they are not wrong either. The self is not a single object. It is a different shape, depending on where you are standing when you look. Think about the person you were 10 years ago. Not the facts of your life at that time, the person. What you cared about, what frightened you, what you thought was important, the kind of people you were drawn to, the things you were absolutely certain about. If you knew then what you know now, you might look at that person with compassion, or with embarrassment, or with the quiet recognition that they were doing their best with what they had, and also that they are not quite the person you are now. The self changes, constantly, quietly, without asking, and yet we speak of who we are, as though the answer were fixed, as though it were a fact, rather than a weather report. Psychologists have documented something called the end of history illusion. People consistently recognize that they have changed significantly in the past 10 years, but they consistently believe that they will not change significantly in the next 10 years. Every generation, at every age, makes this same mistake. The person you are now feels final, feels like the version you've been building toward, feels like the self that has arrived at something close to its real form. But the you of 10 years from now will look back at this version the same way you look back at the version of 10 years ago, with recognition and a little distance. This is not pessimism. It is one of the most freeing truths available if you let it land. The self is not a destination. It is a process, not a noun, a verb, not something you are, but something you are doing continuously with the materials available to you. And if the self is a process, then it can be a different process. It can be shaped rather than simply endured. It can be examined rather than simply inhabited. The self that changes without permission is also the self that can be consciously directed once you understand that direction was always possible. The difficulty is that change feels threatening, even when it is chosen. Even positive transformation can produce a kind of grief for the self that is being left behind, for the identity that was familiar, even when it was limiting, for the certainty of knowing who you were, even if who you were was not who you wanted to be. Grief for the old self is not a sign that change is wrong. It is a sign that the old self was real, that it mattered, that you are not simply shedding a disguise. You are allowing something genuine to become something different, and that is always worth honoring. There is a particular quality that makes something feel true, not evidence, not logic, consistency. When something appears the same way across many different situations over a long period of time, it begins to feel real in a way that transcends proof. It feels like a fact of nature, like something that was always there, that simply got revealed. And this is exactly how the self feels. Consistent, recognizable, present across contexts, and therefore, obviously, genuinely you. But consistency is not the same as truth. Consistency can be the result of truth, of a quality that genuinely runs through you, across time and circumstance. But consistency can also be the result of habit, of a pattern that has been repeated so many times, it has become automatic, of a response that was learned early, reinforced continuously, and executed so fluently that it no longer feels like a response at all. It feels like character. It feels like self. And the difference between a genuine quality and an ingrained habit that mimics one from the inside is almost impossible to detect. You have been consistent. But consistent at what? At who you genuinely are? Or at who you learned you were supposed to be? This is one of the most subtle and important questions a person can sit with, because the anxiety you feel in every new social situation, is that your nature? Or is it a learned response to early experiences where new situations were genuinely unsafe? The anger that rises when you feel controlled, is that your character? Or is it the reaction of a child who once had no other way to protect their autonomy? The need for approval that runs beneath so many of your choices, is that who you are? Or is it a strategy that worked in an environment where love felt conditional? The question is not whether these patterns are real. They are completely real. The question is whether they are fixed, whether they are the bedrock of who you are, or whether they are the sediment of who you had to be. And the reason it matters is this: if they are fixed, there is nothing to do but accept them. But if they are learned, if they are patterns that formed in a context that no longer exists for reasons that no longer apply, then they can, with patience and real honesty, be changed. Not overnight, but genuinely. Because what was learned can always be unlearned. Every family is a system, and every system needs roles to function. In some families, the roles are conscious and explicit. In most, they are invisible, assigned without discussion, maintained without agreement, enforced without anyone realizing enforcement is happening. Someone becomes the responsible one. Someone becomes the free spirit. Someone becomes the problem. Someone becomes the peacemaker. And these roles, once established, become extraordinarily self-perpetuating, because the system actively rewards the behavior that keeps the role intact. The role that was assigned to you in childhood did not end when childhood did. It followed you into every room you have entered since. The responsible one grows up and attracts people who need rescuing, because that is the dynamic they know how to navigate. The peacemaker becomes the adult who cannot tolerate conflict, because conflict, in the family system, was something they learned to prevent at all costs. The problem becomes the adult who unconsciously recreates situations that confirm their troublesome identity, because the identity, however painful, is the one that was reinforced most consistently. Roles become templates. Templates become expectations. Expectations become self-fulfilling. What is particularly strange about this is that the roles often feel like genuine freedom. The person who was always the responsible one often genuinely values responsibility. They did not choose the role under duress. They grew into it, shaped themselves around it, built their competencies and their identity in alignment with it. But there is a difference between choosing responsibility from a place of genuine values and being unable to put it down, because the fear of what happens when you are not responsible is simply too great. One is a strength, the other is a sentence. The way to tell the difference is in the body, in what happens when you are asked to step outside the role. If the responsible person is asked to let something go, to allow someone else to handle it, to be helpless for a moment, is there relief? Or is there anxiety so sharp it is almost indistinguishable from terror? If there is terror, the role is not a choice. It is an identity built over a wound. And the wound is worth finding, not to be destroyed by it, but to understand, finally, why it has been running so much of the show. There are moments in almost every life when the self-story cracks. They are not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a conversation that ends differently than you expected. A choice you make that surprises even you. A reaction you have that doesn't match the person you believe yourself to be. A moment of tenderness from someone you had decided was not capable of it. A moment of cruelty from someone you had decided was entirely safe. Something happens that the story cannot quite absorb. And in that gap, just for a moment, something else becomes visible. The crack in the story is not a failure. It is the most important thing that can happen to a person, because the crack is where the truth gets in. These moments of rupture are the points where genuine growth becomes possible. Not comfortable, not clean, possible, because they force a question that the intact story never had to answer. If this is not who I thought I was, then who am I? That question is disorienting. It is supposed to be. Disorientation is what the solid ground feels like when it turns out it was not as solid as you thought. But disorientation is also what openness feels like from the inside. Because for a moment, the story is not running. And in the space where the story used to be, something more honest might just fit. Most people respond to these cracks by rebuilding as fast as possible. They explain the inconsistency away. They find reasons the moment didn't count. They reassemble the narrative, patch the gap, and move forward with the story more or less intact. This is understandable. The story feels like survival. Without it, who are you? But the people who allow the crack to stay open just a little longer, who resist the urge to rebuild immediately, who sit in the uncertainty and let it do its work, those people tend to emerge on the other side with a self that is both more honest and more genuinely theirs. The crack is not the end of the self. It is the end of a version of the self, a version that was built on assumptions that the crack has now called into question. And what replaces it is built differently, not on the foundations laid by other people's expectations or early experiences or survival strategies that outlived their usefulness, but on something examined, something chosen, something that belongs to you, not because you were shaped into it before you could resist, but because you looked at it, honestly, and said, yes, this is what I actually am. Here is something worth pausing on. If the self is a story, if the identity is a construction built on memory and experience and inherited templates, then who is the one noticing this? Who is the part of you that can step back and observe the patterns? Who is it that reads these words and feels them land with a sense of recognition? Who is it that can say, yes, I do that. I see that pattern in myself. That noticing, that capacity for self-observation is one of the most extraordinary things about being human. And it is also one of the most overlooked. There is a part of you that is not the story. That was never the story. It is the awareness that can observe the story from a slight distance. The part that can notice when you are being driven by an old pattern. The part that can catch itself mid-reaction and ask, is this mine? Or is this the wound speaking? This part is not louder than the story. Most of the time, it is much quieter. But it is always there. And the degree to which you have access to it, the degree to which you can hear it above the noise of the narrative, is the degree to which genuine self-knowledge becomes possible. You are not only the self that was constructed, you are also the one who can see that it was constructed. And that second thing is the beginning of real freedom. Cultivating this observer, this quiet, non-judgmental part that can watch the self without immediately being swept up in it, is the practical work of genuine self-understanding. It does not require years of therapy or meditation retreats or radical life changes. It requires, simply, the habit of pausing, of noticing before reacting, of asking, in small moments, what is actually happening here? Not in the situation, in me. What is being triggered? What old story is running? Is this response proportionate to what is actually in front of me? Or is it proportionate to something else, something older, something I haven't yet fully seen? This is not navel-gazing. It is not self-obsession. It is precision. The ability to distinguish between what is genuinely you and what is the accumulated sediment of who you were shaped to be. That distinction changes everything. Every relationship, every decision, every moment in which you respond to the world with your actual self rather than the automatic one. The observer is not the answer to the question of who you are, but it is the only part of you that is truly capable of looking for the answer. There is a particular kind of relief that becomes available when you stop being certain about who you are. Not the relief of confusion, not the anxiety of having no ground beneath you. Something different, something quieter. The relief of no longer having to maintain a fixed image, of no longer having to defend conclusions that were never fully examined, of allowing the self to be, for perhaps the first time, genuinely open, not as a problem to be solved, but as a question worth living. Most people spend enormous energy maintaining the self, protecting its image, ensuring that the story remains coherent, that the identity remains consistent, that the person they believe themselves to be is the person that gets confirmed in every interaction. This is exhausting work, and it happens so constantly, so automatically, that most people have never experienced what life feels like without it, have never felt the particular lightness of simply being present, without the ongoing effort of being a someone in particular. Not knowing exactly who you are is not the same as being lost. Sometimes, it is the closest thing to being found. The people who seem most genuinely at peace are rarely the people who have the firmest, most certain sense of self. They tend to be the people who hold themselves lightly, who can say, with real comfort, I don't fully know who I am. I am finding out continuously. I have been shaped by things I didn't choose, and I am choosing now, with whatever freedom that awareness gives me. I contain contradictions. I have been wrong about myself, and I will be wrong again. And I am interested in that, rather than threatened by it. This is the invitation at the end of everything that has been explored tonight. Not to destroy the self, not to conclude that you are nothing, or that identity is an illusion not worth taking seriously, but to hold it differently, to carry the self with curiosity rather than conviction, to remain genuinely open to the possibility that the person you are still becoming is more interesting, more spacious, more fully yours than the person you have spent your whole life believing you already were. The question, who am I, is not a question with a final answer. It is the most important question a person can keep asking. Not once, not occasionally, for as long as there is a you to ask it.